And President Marcos is ordering the Philippine Armed Forces to defend the country's sovereignty while preparing for the next frontier, which is space.
Whatever they're doing right now, do not do it and get out of where they are. Baho de Masinloc, for example, is 900 kilometers away from them. It is 100 or so nautical miles from us. What is it to them to get out of our EEZ? They don't need it. They need it for expansionism.
President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has just given the Philippine military one of its clearest instructions yet: hold the line in the West Philippine Sea. On the surface, those are only few words, but they could mark a major shift in how the Philippines plans to deal with China's growing pressure at sea. Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. said President Marcos has directed the armed forces of the Philippines to stay focused on defending the country's territorial and maritime interests. At the same time, he made it clear that Manila will continue adjusting its strategy to meet an evolving security environment, but without revealing exactly how those plans will be carried out. So why does this matter now? Because this order comes as China continues to maintain a strong Coast Guard and maritime militia presence across disputed waters, from Scarborough Shoal to Second Thomas Shoal, while pressure on Philippine vessels has become a regular feature of life in the West Philippine Sea. This also marks a noticeable evolution in Manila's approach. Just a few years ago, the Philippine government focused heavily on diplomatic protests and legal arguments. Even in 2024, President Marcos instructed the military to avoid unnecessary escalation while continuing resupply missions and protecting freedom of navigation. Today, the message is broader. The focus is no longer just on preventing incidents. It is on maintaining a continuous and credible presence in Philippine waters. That raises an important question. Is the Philippines quietly moving beyond crisis management and into a long-term strategy of deterrence? Because if it is, this isn't simply another presidential directive. It could be the clearest sign yet that Manila is preparing for a prolonged strategic competition in the West Philippine Sea. At first, hold the line sounds like a political slogan. It isn't. It reflects a much bigger change inside the Philippine military. For years, the armed forces of the Philippines focused mainly on internal security. Fighting insurgencies and maintaining domestic stability were its primary missions. Today, that focus is shifting outward. The priority is now external defense, protecting the country's territory, maritime rights, and national interests in the West Philippine Sea. That is exactly what Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. was referring to when he said the government will continue to constantly recalibrate its strategy to meet changing security challenges. That word, recalibrate, is important. It doesn't mean reacting to every Chinese move. It means preparing for a long-term competition. Instead of responding only after an incident happens, the Philippines is building the ability to remain present, patrol its waters, and raise the cost of coercion over time. That is also the thinking behind the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, or CADC. Rather than protecting only key military bases, the strategy treats the entire Philippine archipelago, its islands, surrounding seas, airspace, cyber networks, and critical infrastructure as a single defensive system. This transformation is already becoming visible. The app is accelerating its modernization program, expanding joint patrols, strengthening defense cooperation with allies, and acquiring new capabilities designed for maritime security. Stratbase Institute argues that the next phase of defending the West Philippine Sea requires exactly this kind of technologically advanced, multi-domain force backed by credible deterrence and stronger partnerships. In other words, hold the line is not about standing still. It is about making sure the Philippines can stay in the fight for as long as it takes. And that raises another question. If military strategy is changing, what role do diplomacy and international law play now? For years, the Philippines relied on three main tools to defend its interests in the West Philippine Sea: diplomacy, legal action, international support.
If you start acting once the threat is there, it's too late. It's too late. For instance, we are now planning to create our space center, which will eventually evolve into a space force or a space command.
Those efforts achieved an important milestone in 2016, when an international arbitral tribunal ruled that China's sweeping claims in the South China Sea had no legal basis under international law. The ruling changed the legal debate, but it did not change what was happening at sea. Chinese Coast Guard ships and maritime militia vessels continued operating in disputed waters, while confrontations with Philippine vessels became increasingly frequent. That is why Manila's strategy is evolving. The Philippines is not abandoning diplomacy or international law. It is strengthening them with credible deterrence. That means modernizing the armed forces, expanding joint patrols, deepening defense partnerships, and building a more persistent presence in the West Philippine Sea. Capabilities such as the BrahMos anti-ship missile system, larger Balikatan exercises, and closer cooperation with allies are all part of that broader shift. Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. captured this change in a single sentence: legal, without hardening and without deterrence, will result in accommodation and abuse. That is more than a policy statement. It reflects a new way of thinking. The goal is no longer just to prove the Philippines is legally right. The goal is to ensure those legal rights can be exercised without being pushed aside by coercion. That is a significant change in Philippine defense policy. Law establishes the country's rights. Deterrence helps protect them. And once those two begin working together, the strategic balance in the West Philippine Sea starts to look very different. The question then becomes, why is the West Philippine Sea so important that both Manila and Beijing are willing to invest so much to shape its future? If the West Philippine Sea is becoming the center of this competition, then one place explains why better than any other. Scarborough Shoal. At first glance, it looks like a small group of rocks in the middle of the sea. But its importance goes far beyond its size. The shoal lies inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, giving Manila the right under international law to explore resources and manage fishing activities there. Nearby is Reed Bank, an area believed to contain significant natural gas reserves that could help strengthen the Philippines' long-term energy security. So this is not just about territory. It is about food, energy, and economic security. That is why the 2016 arbitral ruling was so important. The tribunal rejected China's sweeping claims in the South China Sea and affirmed the Philippines' maritime rights under international law. But there is another side to the story. Winning a legal case is not the same as enforcing it at sea. Former Supreme Court Associate Justice Antonio Carpio has repeatedly argued that while the ruling gave the Philippines a strong legal foundation, it did not automatically stop Chinese vessels from operating inside waters that Manila considers part of its exclusive economic zone. That challenge became clear again when reports emerged that China had suggested treating Scarborough Shoal as a common fishing ground.
On whether there can be joint development with China on our exclusive economic zone, my opinion is it's not possible because under the Constitution, there's a provision there which says that the use and enjoyment of the exclusive economic zone shall be reserved exclusively to Philippines.
Carpio rejected the idea outright. He argued that if the area were ever to be jointly managed, all claimant states would first have to agree on clear rules: when fishing is allowed, how much fish can be caught, and how marine resources would be protected. Without those rules, such a proposal would risk weakening the Philippines' sovereign rights rather than protecting them. This brings us back to President Marcos's order to hold the line. Because in the West Philippine Sea, the challenge is no longer proving who is right. The challenge is making sure those rights can actually be exercised. And that is exactly why China continues to maintain its presence in these waters, and why the Philippines is preparing to do the same. So, how is China responding? The short answer is, it isn't backing down. Despite growing international attention and stronger Philippine patrols, Beijing continues to maintain a steady presence across the West Philippine Sea.
This is the photo of the movable floating platform that we are currently monitoring in Baco de Masinloc. It has a deck area of approximately 30 square meters. Roughly, the dimensions are 5 meter to 6 to 7 meter in length.
According to Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson Rear Admiral J. Terriella, China recently removed one platform at Scarborough Shoal. At first, that sounded like a positive step. But the bigger picture tells a different story. Terriella said 7 Chinese structures and objects still remain around the shoal, including communication towers, navigation buoys, and other installations. At the same time, China Coast Guard ships and Chinese maritime militia vessels continue to operate in the area, while Philippine authorities closely monitor their activities. That is why Philippine officials remain cautious. Removing one structure does not change China's overall posture. Its presence at Scarborough Shoal remains largely intact, and that is consistent with Beijing's broader strategy. Rather than making dramatic moves, China applies steady, continuous pressure. Coast Guard ships remain on station. Maritime militia vessels maintain their presence. Infrastructure stays in place. Each individual action may appear limited, but together, they reinforce China's claims and gradually reshape the situation at sea. That is exactly why President Marcos has instructed the armed forces to hold the line. Because if one side maintains a constant presence while the other does not, the balance on the water can slowly begin to change. For Manila, maintaining that presence is no longer just about responding to individual incidents. It is about ensuring that China's actions do not become the new normal. And that leads to an even bigger question. If neither side is willing to back down, how do they avoid turning constant pressure into open conflict? If diplomacy has not stopped repeated confrontations in the West Philippine Sea, then what comes next? For the Philippines, the answer is credible deterrence. That doesn't mean preparing to start a war. It means making sure no one believes they can use pressure or intimidation without facing consequences. This is the strategy now taking shape across the Philippines' defense policy. The country is modernizing the armed forces, expanding the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, conducting more joint patrols with allies, and taking part in increasingly complex Balikatan exercises. It has also deployed the BrahMos anti-ship missile system, giving the Philippines a stronger ability to defend its coastline and key sea lanes. These are not isolated military projects. Together, they are designed to make coercion more difficult and deterrence more credible. The same thinking is reflected in the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, which views the country's islands, surrounding seas, airspace, cyber domain, and critical infrastructure as one integrated defensive network. The goal is simple: make it harder for any opponent to exploit gaps in the Philippines' defenses. That is also why Stratbase Institute argues that the next decade cannot rely on legal victories alone. As its president, Dindo Manhit, put it, the arbitral award gave the Philippines legal standing. The next decade must deliver strategic strength. The Institute also stresses that credible deterrence depends not only on modern weapons, but on stronger partnerships and national resilience. In the end, deterrence is not about provoking conflict. It is about preventing one. Because the strongest defense is often the one that convinces an opponent that using force or intimidation simply isn't worth the risk. And that raises one final question. If the Philippines is becoming harder to pressure, how will China adjust its strategy in the years ahead? The strategic picture doesn't end in the West Philippine Sea. it is becoming increasingly international. Over the past few years, the Philippines has steadily expanded its security partnerships with countries that share an interest in keeping the Indo-Pacific stable and open. The United States remains Manila's treaty ally, while Japan and Australia have deepened defense cooperation through joint exercises, maritime patrols, and military training. Even European countries are taking a more active role by joining regional exercises and publicly supporting international law in the South China Sea. Now, Canada has become another important partner. During President Marcos's recent visit to Vancouver, he thanked Canada for consistently supporting the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. More importantly, both countries agreed to deepen defense and maritime security cooperation under their newly established Philippines-Canada Strategic Partnership.
We've also committed to maintaining a persistent naval presence of 3 Canadian ships in the region each year, representing more than 300 days at sea and 80 days in our partners' ports last year alone.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney also announced that Canada is moving toward ratifying a status of visiting forces agreement, which would allow the armed forces of both countries to train and operate together more closely. Canada has already helped improve the Philippines' maritime awareness through its dark vessel detection program, strengthening Manila's ability to monitor activities in the West Philippine Sea. Taken together, these developments point to a broader trend. The challenge facing the Philippines is no longer seen as a purely bilateral dispute with China. It has become part of a wider effort by like-minded countries to uphold freedom of navigation, international law, and a rules-based order across the Indo-Pacific. That does not mean these countries are seeking confrontation with China, but it does mean that pressure on the Philippines is increasingly drawing the attention, and in some cases the support, of a much broader coalition. And that may be the biggest strategic change of all. The Philippines is no longer facing China's pressure alone. Which brings us to the final question. What does this mean for the future of the West Philippine Sea? And can this strategy succeed over the long term? When President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. told the armed forces to hold the line, he wasn't announcing a new military operation. He was defining a long-term strategy. Throughout this video, we've seen how that strategy is taking shape. The Philippines is modernizing its military, strengthening alliances, expanding maritime patrols, and reinforcing its presence in the West Philippine Sea. At the same time, China continues to maintain pressure through its Coast Guard, maritime militia, and a steady presence in disputed waters. Neither side appears willing to back down. That is why the real contest is no longer about who wins a single confrontation at sea. It is about who can sustain their strategy over the long run. For the Philippines, holding the line does not mean seeking conflict with China. It means refusing to let intimidation or constant pressure determine where it can sail, patrol, fish, or exercise its sovereign rights under international law. Whether this strategy succeeds will depend on more than new ships or new missiles. It will depend on whether Manila can continue modernizing its armed forces, deepen cooperation with trusted partners, and maintain the political will to defend its interests year after year. The challenge facing the Philippines is not measured in days or even months. It is likely to be measured in decades. And that is perhaps the most important message behind President Marcos's order. Holding the line is not about preparing for one battle. It is about ensuring that the Philippines is ready for a long strategic competition in the West Philippine Sea. One where patience, resilience, and national resolve may ultimately matter as much as military strength itself.